Well, good afternoon. At least it is here in Vancouver, Canada, and we trust you are well wherever you are in the world and at whatever time it is. And we're really grateful to you for coming out to join us on this discussion this afternoon. This is part of the Ideas That Matter lecture series here at Regent College. And the purpose here is to cultivate theological engagement with contemporary issues that are of particular relevance at this point. Now, certainly the shift in global evangelicalism is one such matter, and we are delighted to have a panel for you this afternoon of some leading global evangelicals from around the world. So I want to introduce them to you first as I welcome you, and then we will get underway with our panel discussion. So first of all, we have Dr. Alexander Chow, who is zooming in from Edinburgh this afternoon. He's a senior lecturer in theology and world Christianity at the Center for the Study of Christianity in Edinburgh. He's Chinese American, born and raised in Southern California, and he's co-director there at the center in Edinburgh. He has widespread expertise and experience in Chinese Christianity, having written 2 books and several articles, and he's a Regent alumnus, and we're just really delighted to have you with us this afternoon, Dr. Chow. Thank you. We also have Dr. Ruth Padilla DeBorst. Ruth is a well-known Latin American theologian who has been involved in leadership development and theological education for several decades. She's joining us from Costa Rica, where she and her husband live in the intentional community of Casa Adobe. And you can see the bright sunshine as she's showing off to us while we're under gray skies here in Vancouver. Ruth currently serves with Resonate Global Mission, and as well as SETI, which is a Latin American theological movement of theological education and formation. She's also on the networking team of INFEMIT, which is the International Fellowship for Mission as Transformation. And she's been involved in these spheres of leadership development for integral mission in her native Latin America for many years. So Ruth, thank you. You are also not a stranger to us here at Regent. We are grateful to both Alexander and to Ruth for having taught with us on campus at Regent, as well as doing long distance things and engaging in conferences. So it's really good to have you back with us for this event. Then we also want to welcome Bishop Dr. Zac Niringiye, who is a theologian, pastor, and civic political activist in Uganda. He's been involved in several civil society-led justice and peace campaigns as a Citizens Manifesto ambassador. He's also a senior fellow at the Institute of Religion, Faith, and Culture in Public Life, acronym Interface, and he has also served at the University of Makerere there in Uganda. Bishop Zac has worked internationally, teaching, engaged in various dimensions of Christian mission. He took an early retirement from serving as an assistant bishop in the Church of Uganda in 2012 to serve in the cause of social justice and good governance in Uganda. Now, Bishop Zac, you have also taught with us at Regent, as well as when we have taken taken students from Regent for a course in Nairobi. And so we too welcome you as part of our ongoing community here at Regent. And we're just delighted to have you, as well as the three of you Regent friends with us this afternoon. We're about to get into the panel discussion now, but I just want to say in advance that having one from Costa Rica and Uganda and Edinburgh, we love Zoom for some reasons, but we anticipate that there may be some delays, maybe even some awkward moments trying to communicate together over the web this way. Please be patient with us as we're going to just await responses from our international panelists. And to you, audience, thank you so much for your time and attention this afternoon. We are really delighted that you have been able to join us for this. So our topic today then is the Southern Cross Navigating New Horizons in 21st Century Global Evangelicalism. Now, I can certainly attest to the exhilaration of seeing the Southern Cross for the first time. It's a beautiful constellation that just dominates the skies in the Southern Hemisphere, and tracking it across the horizon throughout the year was just one of the major thrills of living in Kenya. And most certainly, although it's the same sky, the sky looks very different when you're in the Masai Mara than when you're in the Canadian Rockies. And though we share similar constellations, we get expanded views of our natural universe. And similarly, we get expanded views of our Christian world as we engage with one another from different perspectives around the earth. And so this afternoon, we want to take some time to think about what has happened and what is currently happening in terms of this shift in global Christianity from what we call the global north to the global south. So let's begin there and discuss, let's begin with language just for the sake of clarity, because terms can be slippery. And so when we talk about this shift in the center of Christianity, we sometimes talk about it in terms of Southern Christianity, Western, Northern, Eastern, 2/3 world, global South, majority world. So I would welcome just hearing from you folks from your region, which language is the preferred, recommended language, and what terms work best where you are.
Perhaps I could start. First of all, thank you, Diane, for having us. It's a great privilege to be able to join you all the way from Edinburgh. This question of language is a great one to start with. I think language, of course, subconsciously, if not consciously, shapes how we think about things. And perhaps the question can be answered differently depending on where you're positioned. As my focus has been largely in Asia, the term global south is quite odd because Asia geographically is not really in the south. And actually a lot of the literature related to China and other parts of Asia often speak about the east-west dynamic, and east-west becomes one of the dominant languages that are used. There is a particular historical value in terms like third world or 2/3 world, but it also tends to leave a feeling of being in the third place or the least important next, after first world or second world or whatever that may be. I think that for at least from the vantage point of Asia, the word majority world seems to be the most appropriate. It highlights not only where the majority of the human population is, but it can also be understood as where the majority of Christians are today. After all, 2/3 of the Christian population is in Asia, Africa, Latin America, Oceania, all these different regions. And I think it's quite a significant way of looking at this topic.
That's very helpful, Alex. Thank you. Any further thoughts?
Of course, I'm here representing Latin America. Spanish is my language, and so the relative weight of some of those terms when you use them in another language is another whole ballpark. There is a very recognized musician who sings. The South also exists, meaning in our case, because we are very marked by the weight of the power from the north, anything south of the Rio Grande, Central America, South America, then the contrast is very symbolic. The South is us for many people, and there's all the allusions to migrations, immigration up to the north, The North is also symbolic of power and colonial presence and all those connotations. So yes, we would use the term majority, the translation, el mundo mayoritario, having to do with most of the world is not in that North Atlantic realm. So that would be probably a more favored one, although some people would pride themselves in saying, yes, we are 2/3 of the world, not only one, not the third world, but 2/3 of the world, to affirm our majority status as this majority world. Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Ruth, for that. And especially drawing in the translation as well is helpful to us. Anything further from you, Zac?
Actually, all the above is not very meaningful. It's not in much use except in academic circles or circles in which there are interactions with theology from the North or the East and so on. So in a typical grassroots local parish, I can't ever remember in my work as a bishop in the city of Kampala needing to use any of those words, to be very honest. However, the third world, because it's a term that has come to describe most of the nations in sub-Saharan Africa, an economic category, and that way it's, generally speaking, a fairly accepted language. Accepted in the sense not with pleasure, but with pain, because it's often the case that most nations in Africa are thus described as truly the third, in the sense of, and then there's another word used, developing, or and so on. So the economic categories. In fact, you could have even included the word evangelical. Again, I can't. I mean, you introduced me as an evangelical leader. It's only North Americans and Europeans who would describe me as such. So that too is something that is not, broadly speaking. In fact, in my country, the word evangelical is not what it means in broad terms when it is used in North America or even Europe, I think I would say. So I think a lot of these words are laden with a history of Christianity that comes from the missionary era. And I need also to say that I was trying to rack my head whether there is an equivalent word in my mother tongue, evangelical. It isn't there. And a lot of these words, of course, do not have any equivalent in our mother tongues, whether it's Kikuyu or Luganda or Rufumbira. So in that sense, they are really, really foreign categories that are labels about us, and we don't use them to describe who we are.
Well, that's very helpful in and of itself, Zac, because it demonstrates how issues that can be loom so large in certain sectors of the world church are simply not such an issue or an experience in other parts. So thank you for your perspective from Uganda and from Africa. What about this term evangelical from your perspectives, either Ruth or Alex?
Again, the fact that we use Spanish, and actually that we have one opportunity that I think has a lot of promise in it, and that is that we use the word evangelio, is the gospel. It's so much closer to the original, and so the association of evangelico, evangelical, with evangelio is very natural. Now, of course, that means anybody who is really focused on the gospel, you could describe as evangelico. So there are evangelical Catholics, and there are evangelical Pentecostals, and there are evangelical Protestants, historical. There's the term can be has been used very diversely. Of course, again, we're so close to the North. And the weight of North American evangelicalism is felt significantly, to the point at which plenty of people would question today the use of the term to attribute it to themselves as Jesus followers. And movements, global movements like Infimit that you mentioned in my introduction, we have actually dropped the term from we used to be the International Fellowship of Evangelical Mission Theologians, and we are now an International Fellowship for Mission as International Fellowship for Mission as Transformation. Evangelical was dropped because of its complicated social, logical connotations, and yet we identify as gospel-centered fellowship. So trying to retain the gospel and lose some of those trappings and associations.
Well, that's a very helpful perspective. Thank you, both from the Spanish and the proximity to the gospel, as well as from this wider context. So thank you, Ruth. Anything further to add from you, Alex?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, I'm representing all of Asia, which is quite a daunting task, of course. But in much of Asia, I think the term evangelical is really something that we really don't see being used all that much until maybe around the 70s or the 80s. And perhaps that's connected to Lausanne and InterVarsity and groups like that. The Chinese term, for instance, doesn't come up until the 1970s. So Fu Ying Pai is the Chinese term, and it literally means the gospel group, right? So it's very much like Ruth was saying, it's very much about the gospel, right? But it's a term that comes out really because of the transnational connections with global evangelicals, if you will. And so it's perhaps more of an outward-facing term as opposed to a self-description. Later on, in particular groups will take on that as a self-description. But for the most part, it's because of that transnational connection. The Singaporean theologian Simon Chan will say that the Asian Christianity essentially has an evangelical characteristic, and I think that that's correct in one sense of the term, and very much like Ruth was saying in terms of the proclamation of the gospel. But would we apply something like, let's say, the Bevington Quadrilateral to Asia? I think is perhaps a debatable one. And so it is really, and in many parts of Asia also, evangelicalism is associated with proselytization. And that is a problematic idea and is criminalized in many countries. And so this is a highly contentious term in certain sectors of Asia, although there are many Asian Christians that still use this term in that context.
Well, thanks to all of you. You can begin to see.
If I may just add.
Yes, sure.
If I may just add one small point here.
Mm-hmm.
It is common to find organizations called who use the tag evangelical. Mm-hmm. And very often that connection, that tag connects them to either European or North American origins. And so there is, generally speaking, that label category used for organizations or those who interface with at levels within the evangelical fellowship, for example, or evangelical schools, and so on and so forth. But really, in the regular life of a believer, in the local church, the term of evangelical is not generally used as a self-descriptor for most people. So there's generally a disconnect between those of us who speak English as a way of communicating and those who speak the vernaculars as their way. And the majority are those, of course, who use the different vernaculars across the continent. And yet, of course, you'll have organizations which prefer to be linked with, especially North America and Europe, are calling themselves evangelical, and I mean, I can't think of any who describe themselves by their connection with, for example, brothers and sisters in Asia or Latin America. So there's still this very colonial connection dominance that, unfortunately, one way in which we even accept to be named or labeled. But in the life of the people, I wouldn't say that these are terms that are of any significant value. Thank you.
Great. Well, it's really helpful to have the three of you who have this experience both in the academic discussions as well as the grassroots. So this has been very helpful in terms of setting the stage, if you like, for our ongoing conversation. Just before we do so, I want to mention to all of you in the audience that we very much welcome your participation in this discussion. So if you have any questions that you would like to raise for any of the speakers, please feel free to email them to questions@regent-college.edu. That's questions@regent-college.edu. So now our time is somewhat limited this afternoon, but I wonder if each of you could give, just in a nutshell, a bit of a summary of how did this shift from the North Atlantic region to your particular region of the world? How did this shift in world Christianity take place? And what were some of the key factors in that? Just a brief kind of thumbnail sketch of how did this happen in your region? Ruth, let's dive in with you.
Oh, I'll go for the sake of time. Yeah, it's an interesting question in this, because Latin America, as you would know, was conquered. The original people of what we now call the Americas was conquered primarily by Spain and Portugal, both identified as Roman Catholic Christian nations. And so the conquistadores arrived with the cross in one hand and the sword in another, and they submitted the local people not only to the power of the crown, but to the power of the gospel as they would express it. And so Christianity as a religious paradigm has been present in Latin America ever since it's been called America. Now, what is much more recent is through the centuries, the Protestant presence, but particularly in the 19th century mission work from Europe, 20th century mission work from North America. And that's where you come into this newfound term of evangelicalism of forms versus the contrast between Roman Catholics and Protestants historically. That's good enough as a broad stroke.
Very helpful. Thank you, Ruth. Alex, how about in Asia?
In Asia, of course, the missionary heritage to Asia includes Catholic missions and various Protestant missions and different ways of that. The greatest growth in Christianity, and in particular Protestantism, and in this case, we're talking about forms that might be associated with evangelicalism. The greatest growth really comes in the post-war period, I find, in many regions of Asia, and that during the post-war period, it's interesting that it is in the post-war period, because that is the time where, on the one hand, there's a decolonization that is happening in Asia, as with other parts of the world. But on the other hand, you also have a retracting of Western missionaries. So what's happening is there's a turning over of power, both in political power as well as in religious power, to the locals. And so the growth in many ways comes in this period, 1960s, 1970s. You see growth of different forms of nationalism, indigenous nationalism, and against that backdrop, you have Christianity sprouting up, sometimes in reaction against that. So if there was Hindu nationalism growing in India, in Northeast India, you have this growth of certain of Christianity. The same thing in Burma or Myanmar, where you have the growth of Buddhist nationalism and the response of certain ethnic minority groups of turning towards Christianity. China is a little bit extraordinary, I would say, and I'm biased, of course. But for China in the 1970s, you have the Cultural Revolution, and religion is suppressed. But when Deng Xiaoping opens up the country in the 1980s to a toleration of religion, there's this Christianity fever that spreads throughout the country. And you have basically a 70-fold growth of Christianity from about 1 million Christians from 1949 to about 70 million by 2010. And call it providence, call it serendipity, serendipitous. Clearly we witness some kind of a failure, perhaps, in the communist experiment of the Cultural Revolution and Christianity growing as a response to this vacuum.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you so much for that input. How about a sketch from Africa, Bishop Zac?
Complex.
Yeah.
So how can I do anything in 2-3 minutes?
I know.
But I think the first thing to say is that Africa is really very complex, and particularly because of political history. Although it is a continent, it has the various parts of it. And I think, simply put, you have North Africa, which is primarily the influence of Islam, Arabization, and so on, very, very dominant from as early as the very beginnings of Islam. We have Ethiopia, which has a different story, colonially, and so on and so forth. Then you have South Africa, a long history of white presence, domination, apartheid. And again, the whole colonial history is different from the African countries north of the Zambezi. And so you really have those, because they have different colonial histories, so to speak. North Africa with Arab, Muslim. And that in many ways is also describes the different ways and the times when Christianity came to the continent. But simply put, the current wave that is often associated with what you characterize as the shift to the global south, I think is more associated actually with the rapid growth within the post-independence period, which may be connected to especially not only the first wave of the European, North American evangelical missionary movements of the 18th, 19th century, but more specifically, youth movements, and I'm thinking especially the contribution of groups like Scripture Union in the 1960s, which began. And so the explosion really beginning in the 1970s and 80s, where you really begin to see results of these young evangelists. I wouldn't say evangelicals. We didn't think of ourselves in that term. People were really passionate for the gospel, going across the continent and beyond. And I think that you can think, and there are several people who've written quite a bit about it. It's not yet in most of literature that the primary agency was indigenous. It was these either indigenous evangelists or the younger people who were coming through the secondary schools and graduating. We have a very, very strong wave in the 1970s, 80s of newer charismatic churches, some connected with North America, but it's really that recent wave, in my view, that would be connected with what has been characterized as a shift. Having spoken about, but I need to say this, that pretty much we still are locked in a colonial Christian history. It still dominates. It's still very present in its various forms. So it is important, and I think it's Professor Andrew Walls who made the distinction, which I always find very helpful, even in speaking about the shift. The distinction made between proselytization and conversion. And I think we can say that the movement of proselytizing has been rapid and very strong, connected with political, economic power and on. And I would say that we would have to look much harder to be able to see evidence of stories of genuine gospel impact conversion. And that I'm sure we can talk about later. But I think that's important to say, that there are different ways of looking at it. But I would argue from my vantage point that what you really have as very pervasive, very strong, is a proselytizing movement, a very cultural movement. And I'm not too sure whether I could even give it the credit of being called evangelical.
Well, thanks. Between the three of you, I think already you're raising some really core themes to global evangelicalism today in terms of this rise of indigeneity and the relations with the former colonial powers, and some of the factors in terms of these youth movements and the impact of the fall of communism and this independence and this rapid growth in the East as well. So you're really bringing many of these issues to light for us. Thank you. Now, as we continue, I'm wondering what in your experience, again, I know these are massive questions, but I think even in broad stroke, you're being very helpful to us in expanding our view of global evangelicalism. When you think about the impact of this shift, from your respective region, can you speak to some of the specifics of how this particular shift might have had some impact either on culture and or society? How do you see this evangelicalism playing out, whether or not you use the term, this vibrant Christianity that has come to your region? What impact has it had either on culture or society?
I'll jump in on that. I think one of the major, if I could distinguish the three regions that are around the virtual table today, the main difference for Asia as compared to Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa is perhaps that Asia is the region where Christianity cannot be claimed as a majority religion. So it is really in two countries in all of Asia, the Philippines and Timor-Leste, that you find a Christian majority. Most people think South Korea has a Christian majority, but really Catholics and Protestants combined are less than 30%, and that number seems to be contracting a bit, actually. Having said that, Christianity in Asia has had actually quite a strong impact on society, much higher than the population of the Christians in Asia. For many, Christianity has offered a social uplift to certain groups of society. The classic example is in terms of what is often termed Dalits in India, who in many ways were not even seen as human within the traditional caste system, right? And Christianity provides an uplift for certain groups in society. But you also have the heritage of the missionary legacy, which built the infrastructure for universities, for education, and for medicine. And in many parts of Asia, the universities that exist today, many of the leading universities in Asia today, can trace a Christian heritage to them in different ways. And then you have, of course, also Christians leading in civil society, faith-based NGOs in many parts of Asia. In certain regions like Taiwan and South Korea, Christian politicians lead in the upper echelons of the government. So yes, definitely Christians have definitely made a major impact on Asian societies, even despite their numbers.
Thanks, Alex. How about Africa, Bishop Zac?
I think I would say that it is important and that a distinction is made between, the characterization that we are using here, the shift of the global Christian movement to the south, or global evangelicalism. And the two are not really one and the same.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and it seems to me we run the risk of buttressing one as though it's the other. So,
Mm-hmm.
and I think here on the continent, as I said, the term evangelical is very, very much a label, is a label, and really doesn't say very much about the substance, gospel, and so on, because it's a kind of a mimicking it's a kind of wanting to be politically correct, particularly with the evangelical political power that comes specifically from North America and the World Evangelical Fellowship and the evangelical. You will find that in many countries, the so-called evangelical associations are actually smaller, insignificant in terms of their location in countries and so on. And the primary reason is that those who would call themselves evangelical are later comers on the scene, because you have the more historic, those related to the European, whether it's the Anglicans or Presbyterians or Lutherans or Roman Catholicism, which is the bulk of the main brands of Christianity that are present here. Now, so in speaking about the social impact of Christianity, I think the first phase was certainly forced. It's a colonial story. So education, healthcare, and on and on. So it's part of the impact of colonialism, and it completely uprooted all education systems and healthcare systems and language systems and everything, adopted everything. So there is a sense in which Christianity, sadly, on the continent, has been trapped in European North Atlantic forms. And that's actually a challenge. And often the positive, and there was a lot of positive evaluation of Christianity, particularly relating it to schools, healthcare, and on and on and on. But actually more recently, there have been a lot of discussion on, is this really to be connected with the gospel? So a distinction really needs to be made with, where is the gospel impact? The gospel impact.
Mm-hmm.
And so while you could say that Christianity, European Christianity, the proselytizing Christianity, the essentially the co-optation or the conquest, yes, absolutely, conquest of Africa, the conquest of culture, which is evident in education, in culture, in music, I mean, the piano in the churches and so on. Is very, very evident. In that sense, we are still very much under the burden of the neo-colonial social impact yet to be discovered. The evidence of which is in the struggle of the African nations to find who they are. The question of governance is massive. Evidence that the countries where you have the largest churches, whether it's Kenya, Nigeria, Uganda, just for example, are also some of the most corrupt nations on the continent. So the question therefore is, where is the gospel impact? If you have 85% Christian, Uganda, Kenya, I think somewhere 70 or something like that, Nigeria, very high percentages, majority percentages, but actually you check the quality of life of the people, the question of corruption and so on and so forth. So while you can say there is education, healthcare and on, run by missionaries, hospitals, Christians involved in this, but you actually do not get the sense that there is a real impact on the society itself. What you can actually see is we are still burdened by a colonial past. So the neo-colonial experience, I think is, and there's a lot more writing today. I think 20, 30 years ago, it wasn't the case. You still had a very glorifying, happy story about Christianity and its impact. But now more lately, with the collapse of many African nations, societies, Kenya blowing up in bloodshed after an election, Uganda stuck with dictator, and on across the continent. You are therefore asking really, where is the gospel impact on our societies? And therefore, where is the evangelical? So while you can talk about many charismatic churches, miracles, and the crusades, on the December the 31st, stadia across the continent is packed with human beings praying and shouting and so on. But actually, when the year begins, the countries are simply the same, societies, poverty, and on and on. And so this whole core is really challenging. And I think that the evaluation, the assessment of the gospel impact on the continent of Africa. And let me remind you, although often sub-Saharan Africa is a term that is used to describe the south of the Sahara and north of the Limpopo, it's actually increasingly becoming more the case that itself is an imposition of the West, a way of describing who we are. And maybe we need to think more deeply about a colonial history and its variegated impact on all of us. And yet, actually, for all of us Africans, what we are burdened with is a colonial history. And then the association with Christianity, whether in its missionary form, original, or in its more recent evangelical, charismatic, and Pentecostal, and so on, all those versions. And so the question raised about social impact is very significant as it tests the extent to which the gospel has truly had an impact on the continent.
Well, thanks. Between the two of you, I really appreciate hearing both some of those positive impacts that arise, but also a very sober admission of some of the challenges as well. How about the Latin American scene, Ruth?
Yeah, I think you would see some of the same two sides of the coin, right? On the one hand, historically, the small migrant communities of non-Roman Catholic Christians, so Protestant Christians, were very few and far between. And yet, in the beginnings of our nations, back in the 1800s, at a time in which the Roman Catholic Church owned the nations, if you were not Roman Catholic, you were never born because you weren't registered. There was no public registry. You were never married. You never died. You never had a place to be buried. And so the Protestant presence in the face of that dominating Christendom mode, the Protestant presence was a seed for social change. There was contributions in public education, in public health, in caring for people that were not part of the Roman Catholic Christendom package. However, as time progresses and it's newer waves of mission work, and today, for example, a country like Guatemala talks about 40 to 60% evangelical, Pentecostal, charismatic Christians. And they claim to have had 2 Christian evangelical presidents, and yet under their rule, the countries went through the worst abuses of human rights in the history of the country. And so this growth of this new brand of Christianity has made many people say, okay, it was their turn before. They had the power, the Roman Catholics did. Now it's our turn. So now we need to have that Christendom, privileges of Christendom, because now we are the majority. So even though there are seeds of some of these social uplift, as you were mentioning, Alex, and some of those opportunities are opening up for people through the charismatic movements and such, there is this other side of the coin that is, as Zac was portraying, kind of a superficial label without the depth of the commitment and the involvement in society for the common good, rather than just my own privilege as a up and coming social group.
Right. And clearly no room whatsoever for any sense of triumphalism, is there? You sometimes get this attitude of triumphalism that somehow in the shift to the global south that the dynamics are changing, and there can be some notes that are less helpful in that regard. But speaking about this shift, I mean, it's quite remarkable that next year it will be 50 years since Andrew Walls coined that term, the shift from the global North Atlantic to the global South, shift in the demographics of Christianity. He spoke it in 72, it was published in 76, and here we are still grappling with this shift. And my question for the three of you is, from your experience, how do you see Western Christians responding to this shift? Can you bring to light any healthy examples or possibly some unhealthy examples of how Westerners are grappling with this?
I'm not sure, Diane, that's a good question for me. Because I think it can best be answered by those for whose life is shaped and depends upon a kind of a Western political economy in which, very difficult therefore to really answer the question. I think we can speak about the relationship between the West and the rest. And I think my own critique actually of Andrew Walls' shift is that in my own view was to read movement of Christianity through the lenses of the West. And I think that to some degree that has not helped us a lot in asking questions, deep questions about the gospel. And therefore, I actually personally don't find conversations around the shift necessarily of great value, because I think they take away an important conversation about the gospel itself. Because as I have experienced in short times, so who am I to say anything about the times I've lived in the United Kingdom, or the time I lived in America, or my brief moments preaching in Europe, and then my experience in Africa. There was a time when I chanced over an expression that Christianity in Africa is a mile wide and an inch deep. And that, broadly speaking, I actually do not know even who coined it. But still is the same lenses of reading what's happening on the continent in Africa, using a certain way of glorifying Christianity, I mean, theology. You remember how it was all the beginnings. Theology proper was theology in textbooks from the West. And then those of us who tried to do theology from our own context, Africa, they were called theologies, third world theologies, or they were called contextual theologies, as though theologies of Barkhoff or who are the other big names, Tillich and others, were not contextual theologies. So I think it's the same vein of Christianity in Africa is a mile wide and an inch deep. So I personally actually therefore don't find it helpful to think about the shift doesn't help me, help us in thinking about the gospel. And it's the gospel culture questions that are everywhere. Now, if you're thinking demographics, I think that's helpful. I think if you're thinking about the proselytizing movement, if you're thinking about the shift in relationship to the whole question of power and so on, I think that's helpful. I mean, you can see that the currency or the currency used, whether it's language, it's European, certainly I can say that in Africa, conferences and so on. The money glorified are dollars or euros or The Chinese are making an inroad right now, and it will be very interesting to see what Africa looks like when the yuan, the Chinese currency, is the more dominant and is taken over the dollar. It will be very interesting to see how that happens. So, as the conversation around the shift, I think, causes us not to engage with the critical questions about evangelical gospel questions. And secondly, I think that overall, my experience of either in the writings or what's the name of the next Christendom? It's very much a kind of a, it's not, wow, see what amazing things are happening. No, it's actually like, it can also happen in Africa. It can also, it's like, so I think I have difficulties, to be very honest, and I express those because what I see of the so-called most Christian societies, countries in Africa, they tell a story that is not a pride for the gospel story of Jesus. And the relationships between the West and the rest.
Yeah, well, we can always count on you for your honest prophetic answer. We do appreciate this. And these are the realities that we do want to discuss, whether it's actually the shift or simply the presence of the gospel in these different regions today and what God is doing in and among these various regions. We really appreciate your reflections on some of these realities. So how about from Latin America and or Asia?
I was just kind of piggybacking on what Zac was sharing. I mean, I think part of the question is, this is part of the current mode of globalization of this kind of, which is so market-based, so much about numbers, about quantities, about money, and people have prices, everything has prices, everything is sold, everything is bought, and when you put within that kind of paradigm market capitalism, globalization, and engage the issue of the shift and the numbers again of Christians in the global South, or whatever we want to term it. I think there's some untying some knots in there, because on the one hand, there's an acknowledgement, there are many there are many people outside of the North Atlantic, and the historic, the contrast between Edinburgh 2010 and Edinburgh, 1910 and 2010, and yet, when an author from Latin America wants to publish, when we, as a publishing house, for example, we say, we get asked to publish in English, right? And we say, you know what? These people have written in Spanish. There's valuable stuff already produced in Latin America. They say, but it would be expensive to translate. And I'm saying, you know what? For centuries, we've been translating your stuff to nourish our people until we were willing to produce our own stuff. How much is this shift really acknowledged when it comes down to giving a voice, to respecting, to appreciating, to grappling with the issues, for example, of global migration because of climate change and the responsibility of the wealthy nations in the North Atlantic for causing the devastation we're all experiencing and can't isolate from. So, I mean, acknowledgement of the shift can be nice when you're counting numbers and feel like being, just naming numbers and being part of this globalization process. But what about the depth of responsibility and mutuality that should be marking relationships between the powerful and those with those whose power they have been deprived of power?
Yeah. Yeah, good points, Ruth. Thank you so much. And Zac. Alex, what's it like for you? Because you're situated in Europe, and yet you're also engaging with Christianity in these broader regions. What do you think about these matters of the rest, the versus the rest, the West versus the rest?
Yeah, that's it's a great question, and this conversation is actually in many ways echoes some of the thoughts that are in my mind. Of course, I spent a lot of time in North America. Most of my early life in North America, sometime in the UK, as well as lived in Asia. And it was interesting when I lived in Asia. There was, even in Asia, the interest was always in the West. And that was partly because that was what was taught in all the universities, the seminaries, and so forth, right? So even in Asia, the focus is on the West, and I think that actually adds a very it hints to that power dynamic that exists, that in some ways Zac had mentioned in terms of, do we read Augustine next to Bediacal, or how do we read our theology? Is our theology focused really on those Western figures, or is a theology reflecting a more global reality of the church? I mean, the demographic question, the numbers, I do think that some people some Western Christians would I would say have a genuine interest in what's happening in other parts of the world, but at the same time, one of the things, just look at the United States, which is has a special place in my life and in my heart. But the United States, just looking at the demographic shift within the United States of immigrant populations from Latin America, from Asia, from Africa, and look at the relationship between different ethnic groups within the Americas. And I think that highlights, there is the growth of perhaps certain immigrant churches, right? But there's also the shift of migrants into the historic churches in these Western contexts. You see Asians and Africans and Latin Americans filling the pews, but they are not filling the pulpits. They are not in leadership positions. And that is actually quite a significant image if you think about that alone. Ruth mentioned Edinburgh 1910, and at Edinburgh 1910, the Indian theologian V.S. Azariah talked about how missionaries had sacrificed so much, their lives, their resources, everything, to bring the gospel to India. And then he says, we also ask for love. Give us friends. And I think that's actually a hugely powerful statement. Yeah. That the sacrifices that missionaries gave were appreciated and all, but there was not a sense of love in the sense of fraternity, of equality, of an equal place at the table. That was over 100 years ago. And I think that's perhaps a recurring theme that we still have today.
Thanks, Alex. Well, what if we were to follow that right now? I see our time is going and there's so much I'd love to continue to discuss. But what if we just build on that comment? And supposing you had the pulpit as Bishop Azariah did in 1910, and you wanted to convey something either to the Western Church or to the global church from your perspective, as fellow evangelicals or brothers and sisters in Christ around the world, what would be on your heart at this point in terms of what does this present reality, as complex as it is, what does it speak to the global church? And in particular, what would you encourage towards a Western audience at this point in this mix? So, complex question. If you, when Bishop Azariah was saying, over a century ago, this is where we're at, we need love, we need friends, what would you say to the global church from your particular region? How can we grow more effectively into a global body of Christ? What are the issues? What would you wish to see from your perspective?
If I could, I'm not sure if that was directed to myself, but
All of you.
I'll try a stab at that. I mean, I think one of the things I would say is that every local church, every Christian in the globe brings their own perspectives on things and brings contributions to the global church, wherever they are. For some, it may be an understanding of God's salvation that includes this world and the next, and the implications of that, whether we talk about a type of liberation or integral mission, a holistic mission. For others, it might be a different understanding of community and what the community shapes the church and society. For others, it's a reminder that, as Ruth said, that God is continually working in creation in the world today. And Christians in different parts of the world bring different perspectives and different emphases in the way that they approach God. And I think that if we talk just numbers, there's probably not been any other time in history when we have had, if I could quote scripture, such a great multitude that no one could number, right? From every nation, tribe, people, and language. And if each of these Christians and local churches bring their own offerings before the Lamb of God, then only seen together from the multiplicity of perspectives can we see really a bigger picture of what the church is, but also a closer view. We come nearer to the throne of God, I think.
Thank you, Alex. Ruth?
Yeah, I would say I think there's a real need, rather than people from the West or the whatever North Atlantic, I would call it. I think one of the tendencies is to think of the relationship as we are the ones that have, we are the ones that know, we are the ones, and we then can reach out to those poor people out there, over there, in other places or whatever. But I think there needs to be a first step of reckoning with the problematic acritical association of church and power, of gospel and nation. Some of these things that compose Christendom that are just so much the water people swim in that you cannot, it's the air you breathe, it's hard to pull them apart. Mm-hmm. But that problematic association does not allow for mutuality, for the reciprocity Alex was talking about, for the recognition of the gifts of all, because it's all filtered through that blindfold. And so I would encourage that one of the gifts of places where there has not been that opportunity for Christendom to coalesce in such a lock as it has in much of the North Atlantic, the opportunity of people from places where there is where they have not been that associated is to help open up and free yourselves from that lock that can be so distorting of the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ and God's kingdom and God's justice in the world.
Great, thank you so much. And Zac, how about you?
Gospel of Jesus Christ and God's kingdom and God's justice in the world.
We are at a moment in this time where we are as a people, as the world. It's a new moment, it's a new season, and I think it calls for a way. I mean, we have the internet, we have language, we have China, We have, it's not the dollar. We have the Bitcoin. I think, especially as followers of Jesus, it seems to me, one, there's a lot of unlearning. There is, for example, beginning where we began with the question of language. I think it's time for us to give up, to surrender certain language that it seems to me inhibits a genuine conversation and fellowship. And I'm thinking hard, and one of those certainly is evangelical. And thank you, Ruth, for the shift in the language of Infamit. I think the word evangelical is not of value. It doesn't open conversations. It doesn't enable us to really talk about the evangel, the gospel. The other word is mission. I think that it's a word that was bequeathed to us by the conquistadors of in Latin America. That's where it comes from. So I think that we need to give up that. And one of the ways I think for all of us is to find new language gifted to us not by the powerful, not by the Europeans and the Americans. I think we need to now go to the margins, so to speak. When Nathaniel meets Jesus and he says, can anything really good come from the margins? Can anything good come from Nazareth? And surprise, surprise. So I think the invitation for all of us is to visit the margins, to find new language, ways of expressing gospel truths, because I certainly feel it on the continent. The world is tired of language. It does not really speak gospel or bring us closer to one another. I am hoping, therefore, that a lot of the systematic theology books will be put aside in our. I really long for the day when we will not be studying systematic theology. I really long for that day. I really long for a day in which they will not. I don't know. There will not be mission studies. There will be something else. And I engage with younger people in the churches, and I'm really glad they find the language evangelical mission and the things we are talking about irrelevant for their lives, for where they are. And I think I would plead for deeper, genuine conversations, fellowship that involve unlearning, involve renunciation of power, renunciation, in order to meet the other, whoever the other is, the inclusion. So I think that we stand at a moment in which maybe those of us who call ourselves evangelicals, those of us who call ourselves part of this big Christian movement, to listen more. And I think the coming of China and this COVID is possibly a moment that wakens us up. COVID, China, and so on. So I would plead for us to listen more. I would plead for us to converse more, to preach less, listen more. And I think we need to come and read the scriptures with new lenses, learn, immerse ourselves in different cultures. That's what I would plead for. I plead that for the people in Kampala, in Nairobi. I would say the same when I go to Wheaton, to India. I want to say the same because we need to find each other in Christ. We need to find each other. And I think that we are blocked by power and cultural paradigms that are not helpful to us.
Well, thank you to the three of you. I think what comes through from the three of you is just that, absolute center of the gospel and of relationship, that we need to listen and learn, and that sense of mutuality, reciprocity that each one of you have articulated. We are grateful. I'm going to ask Christina now to see if there are any questions that have come in from the audience. So welcome, Christina.
Hi, thank you all so much. So there have been a number of questions, and for the sake of time, I've sort of lumped them into a couple of categories. And one of them is really a number of questions about what we might call the reverse missionary movement. We've seen the history of mission was a move from sort of the North Atlantic to the rest, the West to the rest. And we see now that sending countries are different. And one question in particular was directed toward Ruth, asking how might those who identify as descendants of the original natives in Latin America perceive the sending movement that now happens out of the 2/3 world to other places? How would that be perceived? And I think that that's a similar question to for other regions where we're seeing missionaries, heavily from South Korea going out to other nations. How do we perceive this reverse movement?
Well, so the indigenous people of the south of the river, Central and South America, in some countries there are strong communities of indigenous people that have retained their identity as a people, and were not, when the conquistadores came, they were not able to rout them out because they were so strong, such strong civilizations. And of course, many of those retain a lot of social coherence internally. But at the same time, basically the whole population of Central and South America is mestizo. It is a blend of the indigenous with the conquerors and the following migratory waves. And the reality is, there's a saying in Central America, we are too close to the US, too far from God. Why? Because the reality of imperial power, imperial interests, interventions, both visible through military presence and less visible through support to dictatorships, to rogue governments and such. I mean, the presence of the North in the South is so powerful, and the unwillingness to grapple with the association between those interests and the oppression of our people, and the social and realities of deprivation, of violence, of poverty in Latin America are so real that there's not an ownership of the recognition that a lot of the cause for the migration of our people to the North is precisely generated in the North. So this gangs from LA, Latin Americans excluded from society in LA create gangs that then are deported to Central America and wreak havoc in our cities. And so then a family in Central America finds that it is actually safer to pack their child behind a pack of bananas in a truck or on a train than to keep them in their neighborhood. It's safer to send them through the desert to North America than to stay in their neighborhood, that is where they could be raped by the gangs. So this picture then is, we can't romanticize this movement of people. We can't just say, oh, okay, so these Christians now are bringing the gospel back to North America where we're losing it. True. There are studies about the migration of Latin Americans is not de-Christianizing the North, but de-Europeanizing it. They're bringing Christianity in. True. But do those people really need to leave their countries forced by violence, by climate change and such? Or should the church step up into a prophetic presence, into policies and advocating for conditions that would allow families to stay together south of the border, when they would far rather do that than be split and deported and put in cages? So I think it's important to think about the church and its presence and its capacity to minister, but we need to dig under the surface to these issues that are creating those conditions. Sorry, that was rather a long roundabout, but it's pretty important to me that we see the full picture and not just the surface of the church.
Thank you so much for that, Ruth. Alex, I wonder if there are some things that might emerge out of particularly the South Korean sort of movements of mission.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I heard your question correctly, there's sort of two parts to that. One is in terms of this language of reverse mission, and the other part is in terms of the migratory patterns of certain groups, and specifically just now of South Koreans. I think in terms of the reverse mission, I would say that reverse mission tends to be more of a rhetorical language as opposed to the reality. That oftentimes there's an aspiration perhaps of missioning, the lands that sent missionaries, but what is actually happening in that reverse missions? Does that actually happen? So I think there's a lot of there's a lot of problems with the language itself of reverse missions that I think it needs to be kind of teased out. In terms of the South Korean example specifically, obviously South Korea is one of the great mission sending countries now today, and in fact, in parts of China, for instance, you'll find South Korean missionaries in China, for instance, as well as other parts of Europe and Asia and so forth. Oftentimes, there's what you see happening in parts of China is the working with ethnic Koreans that are already how do I describe it? Ethnic Korean minorities that already are Chinese citizens, right? So there's a marrying of that type of relationship, and because obviously there's a land border that is shared, and there's historic migratory patterns there. So I think part of that is what is that missionary activity? Is it missionary activity as such? Is one of the questions. But that is not to belittle, though, that there are a large number of South Koreans that are have a very strong evangelistic cross-cultural impulse. There's a great move of Chinese missionaries as well. There's a great move of Northeast Indian missionaries going into parts of China, and so there's I think migration, generally speaking, it's like the Book of Acts. Jesus says to the disciples, "You're going to go to all these different places," and they stay in Jerusalem. But it's actually the Spirit that moves them, and persecution that moves them, and the gospel spreads wherever Christians go. And so I think it often is a more organic movement, as well as the active choices of the evangelistic desires.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. In the interest of time, I feel what I want to say to our audience is thank you so much for engaging well. I'm sorry we're not able to address everything. This is a great reason why you should take Diane's class in Global Christianity, or go and learn with Ruth and Zac and Alex at their respective institutions. There's so much here. And conflating a whole bunch of other questions together, really come back to this question of what is worth keeping from the West, what is worth amplifying from the rest? And that came out in a number of different questions. And I think that there were comments made in the panel about, getting rid of certain things and looking for others. And I just want to give you all a chance to say one more time, is there something in particular that you think we should really get rid of? Or is there something in particular you think needs even further underscoring? And then I'll be done here and turn things back over to Diane.
I'll try. I'll go first and suggest what we should get rid of to begin with is the word missionary and missionaries and mission and actually try and rediscover the language of the scriptures, witness, gospel witness, and see what that does, because I find missionary is laden with notions of power, dominance, cultural, imperialism, all that is not helpful. And I think that there is that heritage that hasn't served the purpose. So we have several, in their thousands, now millions of Africans in China and so on. They're not missionaries, but can we think in terms of gospel witness? And I could say more. That's one. I think that to say what can we take from the West to take to the rest, again, I think we need to give that up as well. Let's give up describing the world, the West, and the rest. It's actually over. So it's not helpful. So let's therefore learn to ask new questions. And I think what we can learn from the very early gospel witnesses who traveled the seas for various reasons, one thing that we can learn from them, the most effective, the gospel impact in places and so on, was the disposition of listening. And I think that there's a lot we can learn from those who listened to places where they happened to be, either because of being part of a colonial power, but made the most by listening to the people, made connections, built relationships. So listening, I think we could listen more. And I think as we listen more, we hear what God is doing every place, any place, anywhere. And we are able to connect with what God is doing and be able to really grow in this enormous, remarkable reality of who God is and who Jesus Christ, who is revealed to us. So give up socializations around power and the language that doesn't help, that keeps us. So the West and the rest, let's dump it, mission and all that language. Can we learn a new language? And maybe the Chinese will teach us new language. Maybe the guys from the people that Ruth talked about in the Andes of Latin America, maybe the margins here in Africa, in the slum cities, in Nairobi or Cape Town or whatever. Thank you.
Yes, I echo what Zac just shared. I think I have met many, particularly young people from North America or Western Europe who are acknowledging the sins of their nations, of the church, and are chagrined and burdened by it. And I imagine probably some of the people listening in today are like feeling, okay, well, but then is there even a place for me, given all this burden of colonialism and all this that's so bad? Is there even a place for me as a white North Atlantic person? And I think, again, as Zac is saying, maybe we need to undo this West and rest, and this white and recognize that by God's grace, none of us merit God's love, but nobody is exempt from it, and nobody is not called into, gifted by the Spirit to live into God's purposes in God's world. And so have your place at the table. Bring the gifts God's given you, but do so not out of power, not out of imposition, not out of a sense of mission to us or to the rest, but out of just each of us bringing what God has given to share to the common table, and to a table that includes people far outside the bounds of our little religious ghettos, that has a common table for humanity, because that's God's heart for the whole world.
Yeah, I think for myself, I would really echo a lot of what the previous two speakers have mentioned already. Really, in being willing to learn from others and to befriend. Really, back to as Raya's quote, right? To have friends, to have compatriots in the gospel. But I think probably the one area in particular that I think is really important is to be willing to be changed. And I think that's a very hard task. It requires a lot of humility, and it's probably one of the hardest things to actually do. But when I lived in Asia, I learned a lot from my Asian, from other Asian brothers and sisters, right? And then I came to Edinburgh, of all places I came to Edinburgh, and in Edinburgh, I started meeting so many students coming from all parts of the world, right? And, students correcting my understanding of Africa, correcting my understanding of Latin America, introducing me to people like scholars like John Beatty and Musa Dube, Rene Padilla, Randy Woodley, all these various theologians. And through that interaction with brothers and sisters from different parts of the world, and both in writing and personally, I found my own faith not only enriched, but changing, and my own theology changing. And that's a scary thing. When our own theology changes, because we are learning and befriending others, and that in many ways this is the church needs to constantly be changed. Christians constantly need to be changed, to be reshaped, reconfigured in the light of what happens globally, happens in the church universal, amongst the cloud of witnesses across time and space. And I think that for me, wherever our place is, whether we're in the West or the rest or whatever, is that we are in a mode that is constantly a position of humility and a willingness to learn from and to be changed ultimately by God through our brothers and sisters.
Well, thank you so much. All three of you have given us a great deal to continue chewing upon. I want to wind up with just a few very brief announcements as our time comes to a close today. First of all, in terms of ongoing events, Regent College has a number of online events that I'll mention. First of all, the Interface series, which explores issues at the intersection of faith and science. There's also a series on human flourishing in a technological age, as well as a series on reading the Bible right now, exploring different ways in which we need to consider these lenses, as we've been invited to in our discussion this afternoon. All of the information is available on the Regent College website. Then summer programs is also posted now. And so we want to announce that there's a new lineup of courses for this summer. Registration is open. You are very welcome to take a look at those and sign up yourself, invite your friends. I was asked to mention which course I would be teaching. And so very briefly, I'll be co-teaching a course with Dr. Rhonda McEwen on listening by design. That theme comes through. Listening by Design, People-Centered Research for Effective Ministry. But finally, We want to thank our panelists so much this afternoon. On behalf of all of the audience, I want to extend very heartfelt thanks for stretching us, for listening to us, for grappling with us about these very complex realities. I wish this conversation could continue. Maybe we will another time. But please, on behalf of all of the audience, accept our very, very deep thanks for your very profound input into our thinking this afternoon. I also want to thank the Regent College bookstore and audio team who graciously host and produce these live stream events and make them freely available online afterwards. And finally, we don't want to forget the audience at home. You have made this more lively. Thank you for the questions that you brought and your listening and your participation with us this afternoon. So to one and all, thank you very much for a stimulating conversation together.